The Montgomery estate did not feel like a home. It felt like a gilded cage built from oil money and generational cruelty. On the night Evelyn received her acceptance letter from the United States Air Force Academy, the rain outside was turning into an aggressive freezing sleet that rattled against the panoramic windows of the Grand Library. Inside, the only sound was the rhythmic mechanical whine of the industrial paper shredder. Victoria Montgomery stood over the machine like a high priestess of her own corporate cult. Her tailored Chanel suit was immaculate, her diamond rings catching the firelight as she fed the heavy parchment sheets of Evelyn's strategic pilot scholarship into the blades. Shred, shred, shred. The official seal of the Department of the Air Force was reduced to thin, meaningless ribbons of confetti. "You look at me as if I've stolen something from you, Evelyn," Victoria said, her voice dripping with calculated apathy. She didn't even look up. "I haven't. I am simply correcting a statistical anomaly." Evelyn stood frozen, her hands clenched into fists inside the pockets of her oversized denim jacket. She was 18, possessing a brilliant analytical mind that could calculate wind shear and fuel-to-weight ratios in her sleep, but in this room she was nothing. "That was my future," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling but unbroken. "I earned that. Top 0.3% of the nation. Direct admission. Your future is whatever benefits the Montgomery ledger," Victoria countered, finally looking at her stepdaughter with eyes as cold as Arctic permafrost. "You are a girl, Evelyn. In the grand architecture of this family, you are an operational expenditure. A liability until you are liquidated. Your sole utility to this dynasty is a strategic marriage to the Texas Oil Trust next spring. Everything else, the legacy, the shares, the crown, belongs to Jared. Jared, her golden boy older brother who spent his afternoons crashing luxury sports cars and his nights being bailed out by family lawyers. Yet because of his chromosomes, he was the heir." "I won't do it." Evelyn said the words heavy and final. Victoria paused, a cruel mocking smile touching her lips. "Then you will starve. Look around you. Without the Montgomery name, you are a ghost in a flight suit." That night the storm peaked. Evelyn didn't pack her designer clothes or the jewelry forced upon her for society galas. Instead, she went to the attic and dragged out 2 battered olive-drab canvas military duffel bags, relics from her late biological mother's brief time in logistics. She stuffed them with basic thermalware, a few worn flight manuals, and her mother's old pilot watch. When she walked out of the iron gates of the Montgomery Manor, the freezing rain soaked through her jacket within seconds. She didn't look back. She had no money, no safety net, and a family that had officially erased her existence. But as she walked down the dark, icy highway toward the nearest transit station, her chest felt lighter than it ever had. They thought they had destroyed her wings, but they had merely stripped away the dead weight. The Air Force did not offer a rescue. It offered a crucible. If Evelyn thought the emotional abuse of her childhood was hell, the elite training pipelines of the Strategic Air Command taught her a new definition of the word. For the next 4 years, she didn't just survive, she weaponized her isolation. While her peers received care packages and phone calls from proud parents, Evelyn's mailbox remained empty. She didn't care. The only family she needed was the instrument panel of a T-38 Talon, and later the cavernous, lethal cockpit of America's next-generation strategic bombers. She dragged herself through Hell Week in survival school, starving in the wilderness, her skin blistering from frostbite. But her true battlefield was the stratosphere. "Hypoxia check, Montgomery." The instructor's voice crackled through the comms during a high-altitude endurance flight. "We're pushing to 60,000 feet. State your parameters." Evelyn's vision was narrowing. The edges of her peripheral sight were turning into a blurry dark vignette, the terrifying onset of a G-induced blackout. Her lungs burned for oxygen in the thin atmosphere, and her fingers felt like lead weights against the throttle. "You are an operational expenditure." Victoria's voice echoed in her mind, a phantom from her past, a liability. "Negative." Evelyn snarled into her mask, her jaw locking. She squeezed her lower body muscles, forcing blood back up to her brain, shattering the darkness through sheer, unadulterated willpower. "Parameters normal. Pushing through the ceiling." Month after month, she endured the hostile, silent vacuum of the upper atmosphere. She flew missions where the outside temperature was minus 70 degrees Fahrenheit, where a single micro tear in her pressure suit meant her blood would literally boil. She became a ghost of the skies, silent, hyper-focused, and utterly lethal. She wasn't flying for Uncle Sam, and she wasn't flying for glory. She was flying to put as many vertical miles between herself and the Montgomery family as humanly possible. On the ground, she was a discarded daughter. At Mach 1.5, she was a god of wind and titanium. The deployment was classified as a routine Arctic sovereignty patrol, but Evelyn knew better. It was late autumn, and the Bering Strait was a swirling, chaotic abyss of black water, jagged sea ice, and geopolitics on a knife edge. Evelyn was the aircraft commander of an advanced, low-observable stealth bomber. Her mission was to loiter in the dead zones of enemy radar, providing a strategic umbrella for a joint service Black Ops team on the ground. Then the world fell apart. "Mayday! Mayday, Vanguard lead!" A panicked, static-laced voice broke through the secure, encrypted channel. It was the comms officer of the isolated commando team on a frozen island below. "We are compromised. Heavy anti-air assets closing in. Ambush. We need an immediate extraction corridor, or we're wiped out in 5 minutes." Before Evelyn could coordinate with Air Combat Command, a massive concussive shudder rocked her bomber. A surface-to-air missile detonate proxied by an advanced tracking array had exploded near their left wing. Alarm screamed in her headset. The master caution panel lit up like a Christmas tree. "Left engine fire. Hide system 2. 2 failing," her co-pilot yelled, his eyes wide with panic. "We lost our primary comms array, Captain. We're blind and deaf. Protocol says we abort, turn south, and eject over safe waters." "Look down," Evelyn commanded, her voice terrifyingly calm. Her knuckles were white on the control stick as she fought the heavy, dying aircraft. "If we turn south, those 12 men down there die in the snow. We are their only umbrella. But we have no radar navigation. The jet wash is pushing us into the mountain ridge." Evelyn didn't need radar. She closed her eyes for a microsecond, visualizing the atmospheric charts she had memorized. She felt the heavy buffeting of the aircraft, reading the jet stream through the vibration of her seat. "I've got the jet," she said. She plunged the burning stealth bomber directly into the heart of the Arctic storm. Using the extreme turbulence of the jet stream to mask their thermal signature from enemy tracking, she guided the crippled aircraft through a narrow valley of anti-air missile coverage. With her left engine spewing a trail of sparks and fire into the sub-zero night, she executed a high G bank, intentionally exposing her aircraft's belly to draw the enemy's radar tracking away from the escaping commando transport. The airframe groaned, rivets screaming under the immense stress. Missile warning tones wailed in her ears. 3, 4, 5 locks. She waited until the absolute last second, dropping chaff and flares in a spectacular, blinding cascade, diving into the low-altitude sea fog just as the enemy missiles detonated uselessly in the clouds above. The commandos escaped. Evelyn flew the shattered, burning husk of a billion-dollar bomber back to an auxiliary runway in Alaska, landing on a strip of solid ice with no nose gear telemetry. She brought her crew home alive. 3 weeks later, in a windowless room deep within the Pentagon, a 4-star general pinned the Air Force Cross, the nation's second highest military decoration for valor, onto her uniform. "Incredible work, Captain," the general said solemnly. "But because of the sensitive nature of this operation, your citation is classified under a black budget ledger. No press, no public record. As far as the world is concerned, you were never there." Evelyn looked at her medal, then looked the general in the eye. "I didn't do it for the world, sir." The prestigious Washington Society Gala was in full swing at a luxury hotel in D.C. The Montgomery family was out in full force, celebrating Jared's appointment to the board of directors of their global energy conglomerate. Victoria Montgomery stood in the center of a circle of senators and tech CEOs holding a glass of vintage champagne. "Oh yes, we are very proud of Jared," Victoria glibly told an interested investor. "He's the true anchor of our family's future, taking the reins of the Texas Trust." A local society reporter paused near their table. "And what about your daughter, Evelyn? I remember she joined the military a few years ago. How is her career progressing?" Victoria let out a soft, dismissive laugh, waving her manicured hand. "Oh, poor Evelyn. She always had unrealistic expectations. She's just a low-level clerk, really. A glorified office gopher doing administrative tasks in Washington. I believe she cleans out spare parts inventories or files paperwork in some basement office. We try not to bring it up. The military can be so unglamorous for someone who couldn't make it in the real world." Jared chuckled beside her, loosening his silk tie. "Yeah, she's basically a glorified janitor with a security badge." Just then, a hush fell over the grand ballroom. The heavy double doors swung open, and a contingent of high-ranking military officials walked in, escorting the keynote speaker for the evening's defense charity segment. At the front of the formation walked a young woman. Her posture was straight as a razor, her shoulders broad, carrying the immense gravity of someone who had looked death in the face at 60,000 feet and didn't blink. She wore the pristine Air Force mess dress uniform. On her shoulders were the silver tracks of a captain, and pinned to her coat, catching the glittering chandelier light, was a row of ribbons topped by a distinctive dark blue ribbon with a white and red center stripe, the Air Force Cross. It was Evelyn. The entire room, filled with defense contractors, politicians, and generals, instinctively stood up. The applause started as a murmur and built into a thunderous standing ovation. Victoria's champagne glass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the marble floor, the sparkling liquid soaking into her expensive gown. Jared choked on his drink, his face turning an unseemly shade of crimson. Evelyn walked past the Montgomery table. She didn't stop. She didn't glare. She didn't seek petty vengeance. She simply turned her head, her piercing ice-blue eyes locking onto Victoria's pale, horrified face for a single devastating second. In that look, there was no anger. There was only the absolute cold indifference of a predator looking at an insect. Evelyn had flown through the fires of the stratosphere and survived the black budgets of the frozen north. She had built a kingdom out of her own blood and willpower. As Evelyn took the podium, introduced by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff himself, Victoria and Jared looked down at their pristine, expensive shoes, suddenly realizing that in the ledger of real human worth, they were completely bankrupt. The 99th floor of the Willis Tower did not breathe. It hovered above Chicago like a structural cloud of steel and polarized glass, insulated from the gritty reality of the streets below. Inside the Sky Shatter Pavilion, the VIP conference room smelled of expensive leather, Cuban tobacco, and the distinct metallic tang of absolute corporate power. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city looked like an intricate circuit board, completely vulnerable to those who held the switches. At the head of the 40-foot mahogany table sat the Montgomery Vanguard, arranged with military precision by their lead asset, Marcus Vance. Vance was a legal assassin in an $8,000 bespoke Tom Ford suit. He was currently adjusting his silk pocket square, his eyes darting across the room to Victoria Montgomery. Victoria sat like a dethroned queen, desperate to reclaim her crown, her manicured fingers tapping a furious silent rhythm on her Hermes clutch. Beside her, Richard Montgomery, Evelyn's biological father, stared blankly at his reflection in the polished wood, his jaw set in a mask of patriarchal fury. And then there was Jared, the golden boy, the heir to nothing but debt and unearned arrogance, swirling a glass of vintage Dom Perignon as if he had already won the war. The heavy double doors of the pavilion clicked open. The contrast was immediate, jarring, and utterly deliberate. Evelyn didn't walk into the room. She occupied it. She wore her pristine Air Force service dress uniform, the deep midnight blue wool sharp enough to cut paper, the silver captain's tracks on her epaulets gleaming under the recessed LED lighting. Her chest was a tapestry of ribbons, a vibrant mosaic of blues, reds, and golds capped by the unmistakable heavy bronze and enamel design of the Air Force Cross. But it was her feet that broke the illusion of high society decorum. She hadn't had time to change into standard low quarters. Her tactical flight boots were scuffed, weathered, and deeply embedded with the faint, pungent scent of JP-8 jet fuel. She had literally stepped out of the cockpit of an RC-135 rivet joint after an emergency 14-hour reconnaissance orbit over the North Atlantic boarded a military transport into O'Hare and taken a secure vehicle directly to the Loop. She was a weapon straight from the theater of operations, dropping into a room full of people who only understood conflict through balance sheets. "You're late, Evelyn," Richard Montgomery said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that had once commanded boardrooms across the hemisphere. "We've been sitting here for 45 minutes. Your lack of respect for this family's time is consistent with your history of rebellion." Evelyn didn't offer an apology. She didn't take the leather chair offered by the low-level firm associate. Instead, she stood at the opposite end of the mahogany expanse, her posture locked into a rigid defensive spine. The atmospheric conditions over the Great Lakes required a tactical descent profile, Evelyn replied, her voice completely stripped of emotion. It was the flat, measured tone of a pilot reciting a pre-flight checklist. "Let's begin. I have an operational debrief at midnight." Marcus Vance smiled, a slow, predatory tightening of his lips as he tapped his tablet. "Of course, Captain. Let us address the matter of your unearned inheritance." The lights in the pavilion dimmed automatically as Vance initiated a high-definition presentation on the massive wall-mounted screens. Complex financial graphics, land surveys of Wyoming, and logistics flowcharts illuminated the darkened room, casting a cold blue glow over Jared's grinning face. "What we are looking at here," Vance began, his voice taking on the theatrical resonance of a seasoned litigator, "is a profound misallocation of strategic assets. The Jackson Hole Logistics and Transport Complex, currently held under a restrictive private trust in Captain Montgomery's name, is a vital piece of North American infrastructure. It features a private heavy aircraft-capable runway, secure subterranean storage, and autonomous fueling systems." Vance struck a key, bringing up a massive red circle over the Montgomery Energy logo. Currently, Montgomery Energy, under the visionary leadership of Jared Montgomery, is expanding our federal defense transport infrastructure. We are the actual practical backbone of the Pentagon's domestic supply chain. Yet this critical node in Wyoming is being hoarded by a single selfish individual who uses it for what to park surplus military hardware and conduct unrecorded flights under the guise of national security. Jared set his champagne glass down with a sharp, deliberate clink that echoed off the glass walls. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of malice and desperation. "Let's cut through this government propaganda, Evie," Jared sneered, using the childhood nickname he knew she despised. You love the uniform, we get it. The posters look great. You get to sit in a basement in DC or wherever they hide you, typing up cargo manifests, counting spare parts, and pretending you're saving the world. But real power, real influence, it belongs to the people who sign the 9-figure defense contracts with the Joint Chiefs, the people who actually keep the lights on at the Pentagon. Evelyn remained perfectly still. She didn't interrupt. She watched the presentation transition to a financial ledger showing a massive gaping deficit in Montgomery Energy's third-quarter projections, a deficit caused by Jared's catastrophic speculation on European oil futures. You've run the family firm into a liquidity crisis, Evelyn stated flatly. It wasn't a question. Jared's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before hardening. We are restructuring, and the Jackson Hole complex is our collateral. You're going to sign the transfer deed over to Montgomery Energy today. Consider it a bill payment for 15 years of family betrayal. You took our name, you took our status, and then you ran away to play G.I. Jane on the taxpayer's dime. It's time to pay the rent. The Jackson Hole complex was left to me directly by our maternal grandfather, Evelyn said, her eyes shifting to Richard. It is a sovereign facility. It is not an asset for your speculative gambling Jared. It's an asset for this family. Victoria snapped from her seat, her voice dropping its polite veneer, revealing the sharp, bitter claws underneath. You are an ungrateful, unnatural girl, Evelyn. We gave you a roof over your head, and you repaid us by sneaking out like a thief in the night to join a branch of service that doesn't even have the decency to put your name in the papers. Your brother is building an empire. You are a footnote. Sign the papers. Richard Montgomery leaned forward, the full weight of his patriarchal authority slamming onto the table as he brought both hands down in a heavy concussive strike. Thud! The water glasses rattled. Enough of this administrative defiance! Richard roared, his face darkening with a dangerous flush. Look at me, Evelyn. I am your father. I created you. I financed the blood in your veins. You think because you have some metal ribbons on your chest you're outside my reach. You think that uniform makes you untouchable. He leaned into the light, his eyes narrowing into slits of pure venomous control. You will sign the Jackson Hole transfer before the close of business today, or I will personally ensure your precious military career is reduced to ashes. I have 3 personal lines to the Secretary of Defense. I have senators on my payroll who can initiate a mental competency review before your plane touches down back in D.C. I will leak your psychological evaluation logs from your time in the Bering Strait. Don't think I don't know about the black budget trauma they locked away. I will paint you as an unstable paranoid liability who is unfit to hold a high-altitude clearance. The threat hung in the air like a suffocating gas. It was the same weaponized psychological warfare they had used on her when she was 8, when she was 12, when she was 18. The systematic isolation, the threat of total erasure. Inside Evelyn's chest, the old familiar phantom tried to rise the terrified little girl in the freezing rain outside the Montgomery Manor. Her lungs constricted, her fingers twitched toward her side. Inhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. She initiated the box breathing technique, the tactical physiological reset she had practiced during high-G centrifuge training and dark nights over hostile airspace. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. The cold oxygen flooded her brain, suppressing the cortisol stabilizing her vagus nerve. Exhale. 1, 2, 3, 4. Her heart rate, which had spiked to 85 beats per minute, began a steady, controlled deceleration. Hold. 1, 2, 3, 4. On her wrist, the ancient scratched tactical pilot watch counted the seconds. Her pulse locked at a perfectly flat, unbothered 60 beats per minute. Her vision became razor sharp. The room slowed down. She didn't see her family anymore. She saw targets. She saw an adversary that had overextended its logistics line and marched directly into an ambush. "You're threatening to utilize defense sector political leverage to compromise an active duty officer's command status," Evelyn said. Her voice wasn't just calm, it was chillingly hollow. "It's not a threat, Evelyn. It's an execution order," Richard said, believing her silence was submission. He pushed a heavy gold-plated Montblanc pen across the mahogany table. It slid over the polished wood, stopping inches from her hand. "Sign. Secure your brother's infrastructure, and maybe we'll let you keep your little captain's bars." Jared grinned, leaning back, taking a slow sip of his champagne. "Sign it, gopher. Go back to your spreadsheets." Evelyn looked down at the pen. She didn't touch it. Instead, she reached into the tactical pocket on the sleeve of her service dress jacket and pulled out a small matte black encrypted storage drive. She placed it on the table with a soft, solid click. "Marcus Vance." Evelyn said, her eyes locking onto the lawyer first. "As a partner at Vance & Associates, you are well aware of United States Code Title 18 Section 793, the gathering, transmitting, or losing of defense information." Vance's smile vanished. His eyebrows knitted together. "What are you talking about?" 2 weeks ago, Montgomery Energy initiated an unflagged server migration to a secondary data center in Frankfurt. Evelyn continued, her voice echoing off the glass walls of the Sky Shatter Pavilion. "Your office oversaw the regulatory compliance filings. Jared, you personally signed off on the infrastructure access logs." She tapped the black drive. "What you described earlier as Jared's defense transport infrastructure isn't just a corporate network. It's an unencrypted backdoor into the Federal Defense Manifest system for the entire Pacific Northwest. By migrating those servers to a non-compliant foreign entity to hide your liquidity losses from federal auditors, you have exposed active military supply lines to foreign signals intelligence." The silence that hit the room was total. The ambient hum of the Willis Tower's HVAC system seemed to vanish. Jared's glass stopped halfway to his mouth. That's just standard corporate restructuring. It's proprietary data." "It's treason, Jared," Evelyn interrupted, her voice striking like a kinetic warhead. "The Jackson Hole complex isn't a ranch. It is currently designated as a Tier 1 contingency logistics hub under Air Combat Command's black budget. The trust grandfather set up didn't just protect the land, it legally bound the facility to the Department of the Air Force under a sovereign defense easement." She looked directly at her father, whose face had gone from a furious red to an ashen mottled gray. Every word spoken in this room for the last 60 minutes, every threat of blackmail, every demand for the transfer of a Tier 1 sovereign defense asset to cover a fraudulent corporate deficit has been monitored in real time by the Air Force Office of Special Investigations and the Cyber Warfare Division at Fort Meade. As if on cue, the high-definition screens displaying Vance's presentation flickered. The blue financial charts disappeared, replaced by a stark, flashing red banner, Federal Airspace Restriction Active / Department of Homeland Security Secure Terminal. The automated window blinds of the Sky Shatter Pavilion suddenly began to descend, shutting out the Chicago skyline, plunging the room into a clinical, suffocating artificial light. From the hallway outside, the heavy, synchronized thud of tactical boots echoed against the marble floor. "You thought I was late because of weather, Father," Evelyn said softly, leaning over the table, her face inches from Richard's. "I was late because I had to personally sign the federal warrant authorizing the immediate seizure of Montgomery Energy's assets under the Defense Production Act." She picked up the Montblanc pen, dropped it into the trash can beside the table, and looked down at her family. "The Montgomery dynasty is over, and you are all officially grounded. The air inside the Sky Shatter Pavilion didn't just chill, it solidified. The heavy synchronized thud of tactical boots outside the doors halted, replaced by a tense, suffocating silence. At the center of the room, standing at a secondary podium that had been hurriedly rolled in by federal bailiffs, sat federal judge Arthur Lawson. He was a man carved from New England granite, a senior magistrate who also held the dual heavily classified title of Director of Defense Procurement Oversight. For 30 years, Lawson had seen the ugliest, greediest underbellies of the military-industrial complex. He had watched billionaire defense contractors try to buy their way out of treason, and he had never once blinked. Until now. Lawson's hands, normally steady enough to perform surgery, trembled slightly as he broke the heavy crimson wax seal on an official Department of Defense courier pouch. Inside lay a single encrypted titanium data drive labeled under Executive Order Title 10. The metadata blinking on his secure terminal read simply file_17.docx. Your Honor! Marcus Vance began, his voice higher than usual, his polished legal armor showing deep, panicked cracks. Whatever theatrical stunt Captain Montgomery is pulling with these alleged cybersecurity flags, I must protest. Montgomery Energy is an open book. We have submitted all required disclosures. Shut your mouth, Mr. Vance! Judge Lawson snapped. The sheer venomous authority in the old man's voice cut the air like a guillotine. Lawson wasn't looking at Vance. He wasn't even looking at Richard or Victoria, who sat paralyzed in their leather chairs. His eyes were glued to the monitor as the decryption matrix of file_17.docx dissolved, peeling back layer after layer of deep black security protocols. Red cybersecurity stencils flashed across the screen, eyes only. Joint Chiefs compartmentalized access. Then came the digital signatures. They weren't signed by a low-level logistics officer. They didn't belong to a glorified clerk. The cryptographic key validating the absolute seizure of the Montgomery Empire bore a biometric signature code that sat at the very apex of the Pentagon's hierarchy. Lawson's breath hitched in his throat. His chest heaved. The professional distance of a federal judge vanished, replaced by a raw, naked emotion that made his face flush a deep, painful crimson. He looked up from the screen, his gaze locking on to Evelyn. To the Montgomery family, she was a discarded daughter, a clerk, a phantom they had tried to crush. But as Judge Lawson looked at her, his eyes welled with tears he could not suppress. Slowly, deliberately, the elderly federal judge pushed his leather chair back. He didn't speak to the court recorders. He didn't address the lawyers. He stepped down from the elevated judicial dais, an unprecedented breach of courtroom protocol, and walked directly toward Evelyn. 6 feet away, he stopped. He locked his heels together, his spine straightening into a flawless, rigid line that defied his advanced age. Then, with a level of profound, trembling reverence that shook the entire room to its core, Judge Lawson raised his right hand to his brow, executing a crisp, textbook military salute. The room froze. Victoria stopped breathing. Jared's jaw dropped so low his champagne glass nearly slipped from his fingers entirely. A civilian federal judge, a man who answered only to the Supreme Court, was saluting a captain. "Captain Montgomery," Lawson said, his voice thick with an agonizingly beautiful gratitude that cut through the clinical room like a knife. 2 years ago, in the black freezing hell of the Bering Strait, an unauthorized classified stealth asset disobeyed a direct retreat order to save a compromised Joint Service Black Ops team. The team leader of that unit, the man who was pulled out of a burning, shattered fuselage while enemy surface-to-air missiles tore the sky apart. Lawson choked back a sob, his hand still locked at his brow. "Was Captain Thomas Lawson, my only son." He is alive today, married with a daughter he named Evelyn. For 2 years I have searched the black budget registries, trying to find the ghost who wore the Air Force Cross for that night. I didn't know it was you." Evelyn raised her right hand, returning the salute with the cold, flawless precision of a warrior. "He was my mission, Your Honor. Nobody gets left behind."
"This is absurd!"
Victoria screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical screech as she slammed her hands onto the mahogany table. "This is a conflict of interest. This is a setup. My husband built this family's fortune. Evelyn is nothing but a parasitic child who ran away from her responsibilities. Whatever that file says, it's a fabrication." Evelyn turned slowly, her ice blue eyes fixing on her stepmother. The box breathing had done its work. Her pulse remained locked at a terrifyingly calm 60 beats per minute. "Let's talk about fabrications, Victoria," Evelyn said. With a flick of her finger on her wrist-mounted tactical controller, Evelyn bypassed the room's main media array. The walls of the Sky Shatter Pavilion exploded into a blinding display of financial forensic data. The file 17.docs was no longer just an asset seizure ledger. It was an emotional autopsy of the Montgomery family's survival, written in the cold, unyielding language of banking routing numbers. Major David Vance, Judge, Advocate General's Corps. A sharp, severe military attorney stepped forward from the shadows near the entrance, adjusting his wireless presentation remote. "Displaying historical ledger entry fiscal year 2020. A massive IRS tax lien document filled the screen. The name on the debtor line was Victoria Montgomery. "Say, 6 years ago." Evelyn's voice cut through the hum of the electronics, calm and devastatingly precise. "You speculated heavily on a fraudulent real estate portfolio in Miami, Victoria. The IRS was 48 hours away from seizing this very estate, freezing your personal accounts, and exposing your bankruptcy to the high society circles you worship. You survived that year because an anonymous offshore trust quietly settled your $50,000 federal tax delinquency." Victoria's face drained of color, turning a sickening pasty white. That was an anonymous investor, a corporate restructuring loan. "That was my hazardous duty deployment pay," Evelyn interrupted flatly. "I was flying low-altitude reconnaissance lines over the South China Sea, drawing anti-aircraft radar fire to map adversary defense grids. Every cent of the combat bonus and hazard pay I earned while bleeding in a cockpit was routed through that trust to keep you from going to a federal penitentiary. I didn't do it for you. I did it because my mother's name was still legally attached to the family deed, and I wouldn't let you drag her memory into the mud." Jared shifted uncomfortably, his hands shaking as he tried to look at his phone, only to find the screen completely blacked out by the Department of Homeland Security signal jammer. "And then there's you, Jared." Evelyn continued, her gaze shifting to her brother like a laser designator locking onto a target. "Fiscal year 2023, Ohio Aviation Materials fraud lawsuit." Jared flinched as a sealed federal indictment from the Southern District of Ohio appeared on the wall. "You bought 300,000 units of substandard uncertified titanium alloy from a black market supplier in Eastern Europe, stamped false aerospace certification codes on them, and sold them to commercial drone manufacturers," Evelyn said, each word dropping like a lead weight. "When the FAA found out you were facing 20 years for corporate manslaughter, who do you think signed the sovereign military indemnity waiver that reclassified those parts as classified experimental testing materials to settle the lawsuit out of court? Who backed your corporate credit line with the sovereign equity of the Jackson Hole facility?" Jared stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. You did that. I insulated you," Evelyn whispered, the raw human betrayal finally vibrating in her tone. "I spent 15 years watching you parasites call me an operational expenditure." I watched you throw my life into a shredder. And while you were drinking champagne and mocking my uniform, I was secretly using my blood, my clearances, and my strategic credit to keep this family from collapsing under the weight of your sheer, unadulterated incompetence. The atmosphere in the room shifted from a corporate dispute to the heavy, terrifying weight of an execution dock. Richard Montgomery looked at the screens, then at his daughter, his chest heaving as the reality of his own irrelevance began to set in.
Evelyn,
Richard said, his voice cracking, attempting to adopt the paternal, comforting tone he hadn't used since she was a toddler.
Evelyn, sweetheart,
if you did all this for us, then we are a team. We can fix this corporate deficit together. The Jackson Hole complex. We can manage it as a family. You can be the head of our defense logistics division. We can settle this right here privately.
It's too late for a family meeting, Father,
Evelyn said. Her voice was devoid of malice, containing only a profound, heartbreaking pity. The time for fixes ended 3 weeks ago when Jared made his final transaction. The screens flickered again, shifting from financial ledgers to a highly technical blueprint of an advanced military drone guidance system. Overlaid on the design were bright yellow digital flags from the Defense Contract Investigative Service, DCIS. The $10 million defense procurement contract Montgomery Aerospace Group has been bidding on the one you tried to force me to leverage my Jackson Hole estate to guarantee, Evelyn explained, walking slowly toward Jared until she was standing right behind his chair. Do you even know what you were selling to the United States military, Jared? Jared didn't look back at her. He was staring at the red word blinking over his company's blueprints. Counterfeit_malware_ detected. 3 weeks ago, the DCIS flagged your supply chain, Evelyn said. To maximize your profit margins and cover your European oil losses, you authorized the acquisition of guidance microchips from an unverified third-party vendor operating out of a gray market hub in Southeast Asia. Those chips aren't just cheap, Jared. They were intentionally seeded with a hard-coded state-sponsored Trojan horse designed to disable American drone arrays in the event of a Pacific conflict.
I didn't know.
Jared suddenly wept, his arrogance entirely shattered as he buried his face in his hands. I swear to God, I didn't know. I just looked at the cost reduction. I didn't know they were compromised.
Ignorance is not a defense under the Espionage Act,
Judge Lawson said from the floor, his voice booming with absolute judicial finality. You attempted to introduce treasonous hardware into the strategic supply chain of the United States Air Force. You used a Tier 1 sovereign military logistical hub, Jackson Hole, as collateral to finance a criminal conspiracy. Marcus Vance quietly stepped away from the table, his hands raised in surrender, distancing himself from his clients as 2 armed Air Force OSY agents moved into position behind him. This is the end of the line, Richard, Evelyn said, looking at her biological father. You told me earlier that you had lines to the Secretary of Defense. You told me you could initiate a mental competency review and reduce my career to ashes. She reached down, picked up the encrypted drive containing file_17.docx and held it up to the light. This file isn't just a record of your crimes. It is a signed, fully executed national security directive. It doesn't just freeze your corporate accounts. It completely liquidates Montgomery Energy under the emergency provisions of the Defense Production Act. The empire you built on the backs of others is now property of the federal government. Richard Montgomery stood up, his legs shaking so violently he had to lean against the mahogany table to keep from falling. His eyes drifted to the signatures at the bottom of the federal seizure order displayed on the wall. His eyes widened in sudden absolute terror as he read the final line of the document. The title authorizing the total permanent debarment of Montgomery Aerospace Group, the signature that effectively stripped him of his wealth, his name, and his freedom did not read Captain Evelyn Montgomery. It read, General Evelyn M. Montgomery, Commander Air Force Strategic Cyber and Logistics Command.
General.
Richard whispered the word dying in his throat. He looked at her epaulets, then back at the screen.
You're not a captain. The tracks. The uniform. The captain's tracks I wore today were my mother's operational rank from 25 years ago.
Evelyn said softly, her voice carrying the immense crushing weight of a woman who had outgrown her family's wildest comprehension. I wore them to remind myself of where I came from. But my actual command authority sits 4 levels above anyone you have ever spoken to at the Pentagon, Father. Judge Lawson stood beside Evelyn, his face grim.
Under the provisions of the Black Budget Security Protocols,
General Montgomery's promotion to the permanent rank of Brigadier General was withheld from public registries to protect her operational identity during the Bering Strait extraction and the subsequent cyber warfare counterintelligence operations. You thought she was a clerk because her name wasn't in the society papers. You thought she was a janitor because she was busy cleaning up your treason. Victoria let out a soft, defeated wail, sinking onto the floor of the VIP pavilion, her expensive Chanel suit wrinkling against the leather chairs as she began to weep hysterically. Jared sat frozen, staring into space, his gilded life completely demolished in the span of an hour. Evelyn walked to the edge of the room and pressed a button, raising the automated blinds once more. The gray, icy afternoon light of Chicago flooded back into the Sky Shatter Pavilion, illuminating the wreckage of the Montgomery dynasty. She didn't look at them as they were systematically handcuffed by the federal agents. She didn't listen to her father's desperate, pathetic pleas for mercy as he was led out the door. She stood by the window looking out over the vast, cold expanse of the city, her tactical boots firmly planted on the ground, her chest rising and falling to the steady, unbreakable rhythm of 60 beats per minute. The little girl who had walked out into the freezing rain 18 years ago had finally finished her flight plan. She had cleared her neighborhood. She had conquered the stratosphere. And as she looked out at the open sky, she knew that the only thing left to do was fly. The heavy structural glass of the Sky Shatter Pavilion seemed to distort the winter light, casting jagged, clinical shadows across the remnants of the arbitration table. The rhythmic, mechanical click of handcuffs being readied by the federal agents was the only sound cutting through the low electric hum of the signal jammers. Marcus Vance felt a cold drop of sweat trace a slow, agonizing line down the back of his neck. His legal mind, sharpened by decades of navigating the gray zones of corporate loophole maneuvers, had completely locked up. He wasn't looking at a disgruntled family member anymore. He wasn't even looking at a standard military officer whom he could tie up in administrative red tape or intimidate with high-level congressional contacts. He was looking at the architect of file_17.docx. He was standing in the direct line of fire of a general officer who wielded the dual-hatted authority of Strategic Cyber Command and the Defense Intelligence Agency. Title: 18 Section 793. His mind repeated the federal statute, screaming in his ears like a missile warning tone. Misprision of treason. Conspiracy to defraud the United States government. Vance's gaze darted to Richard Montgomery, whose hands were still pressed against the mahogany table as if trying to anchor himself to an empire that had already dissolved into thin air. Then he looked at Jared, who was trembling, his eyes wide and vacant, the expensive silk of his tie suddenly looking like a noose.
General Montgomery.
Vance said, his voice dropping an entire octave, stripped of every ounce of its courtroom theatricality. He didn't look at Victoria. He didn't look at his clients. He looked only at Evelyn. His hands held slightly away from his body in a posture of total tactical surrender. My firm was retained strictly to oversee a private family asset restructuring. We were provided with documents that we believed to be fully vetted and compliant with federal commerce standards. We had no operational oversight regarding the secondary server migrations or the gray market hardware procurement pipelines. Your signature is on the regulatory compliance waivers, Mr. Vance, Evelyn said, her voice dropping like a heavy steel gate. She didn't look up from her terminal. You validated the logistical flowcharts that allowed those compromised components to bypass standard defense inspections. A clerical oversight based on fraudulent data provided by the client, ma'am. Vance immediately countered his loyalty, evaporating with the speed of jet fuel on a hot tarmac. With a swift, practiced motion that betrayed his absolute panic, Vance slammed his carbon fiber briefcase shut. The latches clicked with a sharp, definitive crack that sounded like a starter pistol in the suffocating room. He didn't wait for a response. He didn't look back at the family that had paid his 7-figure retainer for the last 12 years. He took 3 steps backward, keeping his front turned toward the federal agents before pivoting and practically bolting through the heavy double doors of the pavilion. The low-level associates from his firm scrambled after him like mice fleeing a collapsing barn, leaving the Montgomery vanguard completely exposed, utterly unrepresented, and entirely alone in the crosshairs of federal execution. The doors had barely clicked shut behind Vance when the physical perimeter closed in. 4 heavily armored tactical operators from the Defense Criminal Investigative Service, DCIS, moved into the pavilion. Their black ballistic vests bore the stark gold insignia of federal law enforcement. They carried themselves with the quiet, unhurried weight of an inevitable conclusion. Jared Montgomery. The lead agent said, his voice flat and devoid of color. He drew a pair of heavy matte black steel handcuffs from his utility belt. Under the authority of the National Security Act and the warrant signed under Federal Case File 17, you are under arrest for Level 1 national security fraud, intentional introduction of compromised hardware into a strategic defense system, and conspiracy to commit espionage. Jared didn't stand up. He couldn't. His legs had turned to liquid. As the agent moved behind him, Jared fell sideways out of his leather chair, hitting the polished mahogany before sliding onto the floor. His glass of Dom Perignon overturned the pale gold liquid pooling around his face, soaking into his tailored hair, as the steel cuffs ratcheted shut around his wrists with a series of sharp metallic clicks.
Dad, do something!
Jared shrieked, his voice breaking into a high, pathetic wail that bounced off the glass walls. He kicked his legs against the table leg, his expensive Italian leather shoes scuffing the wood he had claimed ownership over just an hour ago.
They can't do this. Call the governor. Call someone.
Richard Montgomery didn't move. He stood frozen, his face the color of old newsprint, his eyes wide as he stared at the digital signatures flashing on the wall monitor. The word general burned into his vision like an iron brand. The daughter he had written off as an operational expenditure, the girl he had threatened to paint as mentally unstable, was the literal sovereign authority holding his entire life in her hand. Victoria Montgomery dropped to her knees. The poise, the high society posture that had defined her entire life collapsed entirely. Her Chanel suit caught on the edge of the chair, tearing a seam, but she didn't even notice. She crawled forward across the carpet, her diamond rings scratching against the floor until she was at the base of Evelyn's tactical boots.
Evelyn, please!
Victoria sobbed, the tears cutting tracks through her heavy, expensive makeup, revealing the wrinkled, terrified woman underneath. She reached out, her fingers trembling as she tried to grasp the hem of Evelyn's trousers. He's your brother. He didn't know. He's stupid, Evelyn. He's just reckless, but he isn't a traitor. Use your connections. Call the Pentagon. Call the intelligence director. You can erase this file. You have the clearance. Don't let them take my boy. Evelyn stood perfectly still. She looked down at the woman who had fed her acceptance letters into a paper shredder 15 years ago. She looked at the mother who had told her she was a liability until she was liquidated. The box breathing had kept her heart locked at 60 beats per minute, but the human weight of the moment pressed against her chest like a heavy G-load. She didn't feel happiness. She didn't feel a surge of petty joy. She felt only the deep, clean cold of absolute clarity. Slowly, Evelyn reached down and picked up her service cap from the table. She adjusted the stiff crown, the silver clouds and lightning bolts threw sharp reflections across her face, and the gold-embroidered eagles on the peak caught the white artificial light. She placed it squarely on her head, her fingers checking the alignment with absolute military precision. "I don't negotiate with parasites wearing suits, Victoria," Evelyn said, her voice dropping like ice cubes into a glass. "For 15 years, you told me my value was calculated by what you could strip away from me. You treated the defense of this nation like a personal credit line to finance your arrogance. The ledger is balanced. The invoice for your hubris has arrived. Live with it." Evelyn turned away from the weeping form of her stepmother and the silent broken statue of her father. She didn't look back as the DCIS agents lifted Jared from the floor, his civilian clothes stained with spilt champagne and floor dust, or as secondary teams moved in to begin the physical seizure of the Montgomery corporate archives. She walked out of the Sky Shatter Pavilion, her scuffed tactical boots clicking firmly against the marble hallway. Waiting near the private elevator bay stood a man who didn't belong in the high-altitude corporate world of the Willis Tower any more than she did. He wore a simple dark heavy wool coat over a faded flannel shirt. His hands were large, calloused, with faint burn scars along the knuckles, the unmistakable marks of a city firefighter who spent his days dragging people out of collapsing structures while everyone else ran away. Daniel. He didn't say a word as she approached. He didn't ask about the file, the arrest, or the empire that had just been dismantled behind those double doors. He simply stepped forward, his massive, warm hand reaching out to wrap around her fingers, providing an immediate, unyielding ground line to a woman who spent her life in the stratosphere. "You good, General?" Daniel asked softly, a faint knowing smile touching the corners of his mouth. Evelyn let out a long, slow breath, the last remnants of the tactical box breathing dissolving as she felt the solid weight of his hand. "The flight plan is complete, Dan. Let's go home." They rode the private elevator down in silence, bypassing the lobby where news crews and federal vehicles were already beginning to swarm. Out in the secure basement loading dock, Daniel opened the door of a weathered American-made pickup truck. It was dirty from the winter slush, completely unglamorous and entirely real. As the truck pulled out into the freezing Chicago traffic, Evelyn looked out the window. The snow was falling again, thick and heavy, covering the tracks of the city. 15 years ago, she had walked into a storm like this with nothing but 2 canvas duffel bags and a broken family. Today, she was leaving with her honor intact, her country secure and her sky completely clear. 3 years later, the spring sun over Dayton, Ohio was bright and clear, warming the massive arched hangars of the National Museum of the United States Air Force. Inside the cavernous display halls, the shadows of legendary aircraft stretched across the polished concrete floors. The air smelled faintly of old oil preservation wax and history. Evelyn walked slowly down the long gallery of the Cold War and Strategic Air Command exhibits. She was in civilian clothes, a simple, elegant charcoal cashmere sweater and tailored trousers. Her silver general's stars were locked away in a drawer at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, but her posture still held the unmistakable, effortless grace of a pilot who owned the sky. Clinging tightly to her left hand was a 3-year-old girl with bright, inquisitive blue eyes and a tuft of unruly blonde hair. Lily. After the federal liquidation of Montgomery Energy, Jared had been sentenced to 12 years in a federal penitentiary. Victoria had fled the country to live out her remaining days in a small, unglamorous apartment in Europe, on a restricted, non-seizable pension, completely forgotten by the high society circles she had built her life upon. Richard had passed away a year into the corporate bankruptcy, his heart simply giving out when the final asset auction cleared his name from the registry. Lily had been left behind, a casualty of the empire's collapse, an afterthought in the wreckage of Jared's panic. But Evelyn had returned to the ruins one last time, not to gloat and not to collect trophies. She had gone back to ensure that the cycle of generational cruelty ended with her generation. She had legally adopted Lily before the state could process her into the foster system, bringing the child into the quiet, warm home she and Daniel shared near the base.
Look, Mama!
Lily whispered, her small voice echoing in the grand hangar as she pointed her tiny finger upward. Big plane. Towering over them was the clean, menacing silhouette of a retired B-2 Spirit stealth bomber, its dark radar-absorbent skin catching the soft gallery lighting. It looked like a great sleeping black bird, a monument to the silent power that kept the peace in the dark spaces of the world. Evelyn stopped kneeling down on the concrete floor until she was at eye level with the little girl. She reached out her fingers gently, tucking a stray lock of blonde hair behind Lily's ear. "That's a stealth bomber, Lily," Evelyn said, her voice warm, rich, and full of a quiet, beautiful life. "It flies very high where the storms can't reach it. It's designed to go into the dark, fix what's broken, and make sure the people on the ground stay safe." Lily stared at the massive aircraft, her eyes wide with wonder, before turning back to look at Evelyn. "Can you fly it?" Evelyn smiled, a deep, genuine expression that reached all the way to her eyes. She picked the little girl up, holding her close against her shoulder as she stood back up. "I used to, sweetheart," Evelyn whispered, looking past the nose of the bomber toward the high, clear windows at the top of the hangar where the open sky beckoned. "But right now, I'm exactly where I need to be." She turned and walked down the long, historic gallery, her footsteps light and unburdened. The monarchy was ashes. The wealth was gone. The Montgomery name had been stripped away and repurposed for the defense of the Republic. But as she walked out into the warm spring sunlight, holding the future in her arms, Evelyn knew she had won the only contract that ever mattered. She was finally completely free.
Every story teaches us something. Today's lesson is simple. Never judge someone's value by where they started. Judge them by what they overcame. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. See you in the next story.